the Hill data looks fairly consistent with, what we've seen across a whole range of polling. The first thing to say, I think, that you all are finding, that we're finding, is just how stable Trump's job approval numbers, his favorability numbers have been across his presidency, really. I mean, since his inauguration, if you look at his general approval ratings, it tends to be in the low to mid 40s, no matter what's going on, whether it's impeachment, whether we're talking about a global pandemic that the U.S. is not handling very well. But there has been some, I think, the one thing that we've seen, I guess, in the last few months is actually a little bit of variation. Again, maybe not as much as you might expect to see given widespread protests over racial injustice, pandemic, and the number of cases in the U.S., well exceeding now 100,000 cases, 125 now. All of that stuff, and yet it moves the needle, but maybe not as much as you might think. PRRI have been tracking Trump favorability, and that's mostly our benchmark measure, which is slightly different, I should just say, than job approval. So this is favorability of Trump himself. These track very closely, but they're not exactly the same. So I just want to make sure I've got that distinction. But we've been tracking Trump favorability actually all the way back into 2015, even before Trump was the nominee. And generally speaking, what we found among kind of these key base groups is that actually in 2015, to give you the big picture, among white evangelicals and white Christian groups and even white working class Americans, his approval rating was below 50%, even among these base groups, until he became the Republican nominee in the summer of 2016. Once that happened, all of these groups that are kind of Republican-leaning groups basically jumped in line. His favorability went from the 40s up into the 60s. And then by the time he was inaugurated, most of those groups landed somewhere in the sort of 2/3 to 75% approval rating by January when he was inaugurated after being elected. And they have remained, like as we already noted, very, very stable over time. We have seen some wobble in these base groups in the last 3 months, though. And what's unique, of course, about the last 3 months is that we have, starting in March, number of cases of coronavirus really ticking up dramatically. And then the last month, we've had, in response to George Floyd's killing by Minnesota police officers, widespread protest over racial injustice and policing and other things. So we've had these two things going on at the same time. And I think that has made for a much more volatile environment, even for his base group. So let me just go through a couple of things and grab some headlines from our findings. We found that in March, when President Trump stepped up, I think for the first time, to acknowledge the significance of the coronavirus. I mean, in February, he was still saying it was going to go away very quickly. We'd hardly see any deaths. And then by March, he had stepped up and brought Anthony Fauci and other folks to the fore. And actually, he was rewarded for that action in public opinion data. So in March, we saw a kind of rally around the flag effect, that Trump's ratings actually were quite high, particularly among his base groups. For example, like white evangelical Protestants in March went to 77%, which is sort of on the high end, even for them, in this range that they've been in across his presidency. Other white Christian groups, white mainline Protestants, white Catholics, both at 60+% support. Republicans were up in the high 80s. So he was flying pretty high there. It was actually also the first time ever that we have recorded his favorability being in majority territory through his entire presidency. It hit 51%, so barely, but it did hit 51% in March, and then it's dropped back down since then. But that has been the story. We saw a high water mark with people giving Trump the benefit of the doubt, I think, in March. And what we've really seen is over April and May, our numbers that he's been sliding even among his base groups. And I think the ones that are most notable, white evangelicals, he dropped from 77% in March down to 62%. Among the main line, he dropped 10 points. But the one that I think, if I were the Trump campaign, I'd be the most worried about really is white Catholics. These are groups that are very important in the upper Midwest battleground states. They make up 15% of the population in like for Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and those states are actually bigger than white evangelicals. So this is a really important group for those swing states. He had a high of 60% favorable rating among white Catholics in March. It dropped to 48% in April, and it dropped again to 37% in May. And that's quite remarkable. In fact, that's the lowest favorability we've ever recorded among white Catholics, and it's the first time ever that white Catholics have actually been below the general population in terms of favorability. So in May, we had general favorability at 41, Catholics down at 37. So fairly dramatic changes. One more I'll name here is that we also had among white working class or white non-college Americans, again, high of 66% in March. That drops down to 54% in April and 47% in May, so down below majority support. And for the first time ever, that drop among white non-college Americans actually puts them in basically a statistical dead heat with white college grad favorability, which is 45%. I think these symbolic moments matter, and I think particularly for like white evangelicals who do hold the Bible in high esteem, that even that event for them, I think many of them seemed, like a misuse of, the Holy Scriptures is the way that white evangelicals think about it. So to have a Bible just held up as kind of a talisman, at an event like that, I think is not the way that, most white evangelicals even think about an appropriate use, of the Bible. I mean, even if Trump had opened it up and read some relevant passage of scripture or something, that might have given it a little more integrity. But I think most people saw it, I think, for what it was, and that is a pretty thin, just attempt to hold up a symbol and attach law and order, and Trump's law and order, to this symbol. I think that makes, even lots of his big segments of his base fairly uncomfortable. Yeah, but to answer the bigger question, I do think it's both. I think there's some missteps like that. I think the really inconsistent approach for Trump, so is COVID-19 serious? No, it's not serious. Yes, it's serious, but now we're not going to wear masks and I'm going to hold a big rally. Oh, but it is serious, and you can see in your own states, and the governors are giving different messages than Trump. I think that sort of inconsistency has also hurt him in terms of leadership. I mean, he ran right on being a strong leader. He would say things like, look, I alone can fix it, he said in the 2016, campaign. And so, if you're going to run on that platform, and then, be seen as sort of rudderless, I think, around COVID-19, I think those two things are in conflict. And it's still clear, I should say that there is a kind of 40% or so of the country that is squarely behind Trump, no matter what President Trump, no matter what he does. But that's not going to be enough to get him to a majority in the Electoral College. It's not going to be enough to get him the majority of the popular vote. So I think that extra, 10 to 12% there is really where the battle is. And at least in our favorability data, it looks like among white Catholics, white mainline Protestants, and even to some extent white evangelicals. I mean, he dropped 15 points over the last 2 months in favorability, even among evangelicals. I think the wringing of the hands that we've seen among Trump is, I think, they have some legitimate worries on their hands.